of Duty is easily one of the biggest FPS franchises ever. It's featured some of the most iconic games the genre has ever seen, but with 15 mainline titles released in as many years, it's no surprise that the franchise has had some controversial outings as well. So we figured now would be a good time to revisit the franchise as a whole and go over the good, the bad, the exceptional, and the subpar. The original Call of Duty game was released all the way back in 2003. It was developed by the newly formed Infinity Ward, which was formed by a group of developers who left 2015 Inc., the team that made the unforgettable 2002 Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Now, Allied Assault is truly a monumental game, many credited with single-handedly shaping the FPS genre into what it is today. It's not hard to imagine that many modern FPS games would never have been made had it not been for Allied Assault. To give you a better scope of why this game meant so much to so many people, the game's storyline was written by none other than Steven Spielberg, and its D-Day Omaha Beach level set the standard to which all subsequent D-Day levels aspired. It was nothing short of a masterpiece, and gamers were craving more. This void was filled by none other than the first Call of Duty game, and to everyone's pleasure, it was filled magnificently. Just like Allied Assault, Call of Duty was based around grounded and realistic mechanisms becoming of World War II, which was a stark contrast to all the sci-fi and fantasy worlds that most FPS games at the time were set in. It even upped the realism by limiting the player's arsenal to only 2 weapons and removing all pickups aside from health and ammo. It had a unique single-player campaign that was split into 3 separate parts, each experienced through the eyes of a different soldier, 1 American, 1 British, and 1 Soviet. Needless to say, the game was a huge success, and the rest, as they say, is history. But let's take a look at that history. Fast forward 2 years and you have the release of the highly anticipated Call of Duty 2. Now, it's very easy to overlook the shakeup that Allied Assault had on the industry. The game was hailed as the best single-player shooter since Half-Life, had sold over 1 million copies, and had no shortage of clones attempting to replicate its success. But no other game managed to replicate it to the extent that Call of Duty did, and this includes the subsequent Medal of Honor games. Call of Duty alone managed to capture the magic of Allied Assault, so gamers everywhere were holding their breath that the Call of Duty sequel would be just as magnificent. And they were not disappointed. Call of Duty 2 didn't make many deviations from the formula. For example, there were still 3 separate single-player campaigns, and the game was still set in World War II. But the few changes it did bring were all key. Most notably, there was an automatic health regeneration that encouraged riskier and more fast-paced playstyles. This went on to become a staple of the franchise, and at the time it helped breathe new life into an increasingly stagnant genre. Changes like these were small but very much appreciated, and the hugely improved graphics helped as well. After 2 smash hits, the franchise got enough goodwill behind it to carry it through some weaker outings, and not a moment too soon. Call of Duty 3 was the first game in the series developed by Treyarch, and it's easily one of the most forgettable ones. The biggest difference between the second and the third game are basically the updated graphics, which is not all you want there to be in a sequel. The single-player campaign was slightly different in that it wasn't split up into 3 parts, but that's about it. It was still set during World War II, which is basically the setting for every single FPS game at the time. The multiplayer saw the inclusion of vehicles, which may sound like a big deal, but keep in mind that this was back in 2006. Those of you who were active gamers back then will know what we mean by this. As for the younger viewers, try and imagine a world without Androids and iPhones. A world where cell phones served only for calling and texting, and Wi-Fi was more of a promise than a reality. You'll get the picture. The final point that cemented Call of Duty 3's subpar performance has definitely got to be the fact that it was the first Call of Duty game not to be released on Windows. Luckily, the franchise didn't dwell on this too long. The 4th installation of Call of Duty finally released the franchise from the shackles of World War II era and adopted a more modern setting, as reflected in the title Modern Warfare. It was developed by Infinity Ward, and the devs weren't afraid of switching things up in the franchise they created. The game didn't tamper too much with the overall formula, like we'll see some of the subsequent entries do, but the new setting helped breathe new life into the game by introducing a plethora of modern weapons and gadgets. The campaign explored a series of conflicts set in the Middle East and Russia, and in true Call of Duty fashion, it featured multiple protagonists, one American and one British. The multiplayer also received a healthy dose of innovation with the introduction of a new leveling mechanic and perks that allowed for a greater degree of customizability. Add all this together and it's easy to see why Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is one of the most beloved entries in the series. But of course, old habits die hard, and seeing as the team working on the next installment was Treyarch, the developers behind Call of Duty 3, well, we got another World War II game. But hey, at least the precedent was set. This time around, the single-player campaign allowed us to experience the Pacific and Eastern fronts. What's more, World at War featured levels that were much more open than any the series had had thus far. All in all, World at War remains another largely forgettable entry in the series. By no means is it a bad game, don't get us wrong, but there simply isn't enough there to distinguish it from all the others. However, it did introduce one of the staple features the franchise would stick to after this, a multiplayer defense mode that had you battle against zombie Nazis. The zombie defense mode is very fun and would have been a reason to go back to World at War had the game mode not been implemented in every later installment. Not that we're complaining. It should be obvious at this point that Call of Duty fans were craving for more Modern Warfare, and thankfully they didn't have to wait for long. Modern Warfare 2 was released just 2 years after the original Modern Warfare game, and it definitely delivered. However, while the game was a certified hit, there really isn't that much to talk about here. The campaign continued and the gameplay mechanics remained mostly the same. The only major addition to the formula was the new Spec Ops mode that allowed you to undertake a series of separate missions in co-op with a friend. A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one, as this was the first time fans of the franchise could go on missions together. In terms of how close to the fans' hearts this installment is, many rank it quite highly, although not as high as the first Modern Warfare. However, the game definitely eclipses every other installment in the series in one regard: controversy. This is the game that featured the infamous No Russian mission that comes with its own written warning and was entirely skippable. Okay, so thus far we've had 2 developers work on the Call of Duty franchise. Infinity Ward, that gave us most of the memorable and iconic games up until this moment, and Treyarch, that was responsible for Call of Duty 3 and World at War. However, the third outing by Treyarch, Black Ops, is arguably one of their best, and it reached the same heights that Modern Warfare did. Black Ops explored another setting hitherto untouched by the franchise, the Cold War era. The game does the setting justice, focusing more on the behind-the-scenes machinations and secret operations than on the war itself. It's the first Call of Duty game to feature a single protagonist, but it leverages this change brilliantly by giving him the ability to talk. No longer are you stuck with a silent protagonist that just follows orders like a robot. The multiplayer mode in Black Ops was one of the all-time fan favorites, as it allowed for a more in-depth character customization in addition to all the beloved mechanics from Modern Warfare. It may have taken Treyarch some time to find its footing in this franchise, but this outing definitely proved that they can make some of the best COD games ever. By contrast, Modern Warfare 3 was kind of weak. This may sound strange given that it still remains the best-selling Call of Duty game of all times, but it didn't really expand upon anything from the previous games. As the finale of the Modern Warfare sub-series, it's brilliant. The campaign is satisfying and enjoyable, the multiplayer is fun, but it didn't really add anything new. It's one of those more for the sake of more sequels. We know that some people like to accuse the entire franchise of being like this, but with this game, it really feels like that. Not that it's a bad game. It still easily ranks in the upper half of the franchise, but it's like the finale to Ezio's trilogy in Assassin's Creed. The story is good, the ending is good, but if you're not playing the game specifically for the story, then it loses some of its luster. And for all of you who think that this franchise is just one big case of more for the sake of more, we've got 2 words and a number for you: Black Ops 2. Black Ops 2 is a weird installment. It featured 2 campaigns that were set in different time periods, one in the 1980s and one in the 2020s. What's more, it gave players an unprecedented sense of agency by experimenting with multiple endings. All of a sudden, the way you completed a certain level could drastically impact how the rest of the game would play out, giving you a reason to replay the campaign of all things. If that doesn't make for a worthwhile sequel, we don't know what does. And the multiplayer had some novelties of its own to showcase, adding a weapons progression system that would unlock various modifications and attachments as you leveled the weapon up. Needless to say, Call of Duty multiplayer had never felt quite so customizable. Call of Duty Ghosts was supposed to be a momentous game. It was basically Modern Warfare 4 in everything but name. It delved further into the future, exploring a sci-fi aspect of the franchise that was only hinted at in Black Ops 2. It was also the first game in the series to be released on the 8th generation consoles. But somehow, it just didn't stick the landing. The game sounds different, but these differences ended up being largely superficial. And bear in mind that we're talking about a game that lets you play as a trained German shepherd named Riley. This was also the first Call of Duty game to feature destructible environments and multiplayer, but it all just felt somehow uninspired. All in all, Ghosts is one of the most forgettable entries in the series. Advanced Warfare was the first Call of Duty game to be developed solely by Sledgehammer Games. The team helped develop Modern Warfare 3, but outside of that, they had no credit to their name. Nevertheless, they dove headfirst into the sci-fi setting in a manner that left no fan wanting. With the story set in the middle of the 21st century, the devs were free to explore some exciting new mechanics that would otherwise have been silly. For example, this was the first game in the series to introduce the exoskeleton suit that significantly increased the character's mobility, letting them even double jump of all things. The pace of the game was faster than it ever had been, and with extra abilities like cloaking, portable shields, and health boosts, it certainly didn't lack variety. Needless to say, it became a smash hit, an instant success, and one that would influence future games in the series. You may have noticed a trend with some of these games. Call of Duty 3 was the first underwhelming game in the series, and for all of Modern Warfare's glory, the third installment is remembered as one of the weaker outings creatively. If there was no doubt before as to whether third installments in this franchise were cursed, Black Ops 3 is here to confirm this. It was the first Black Ops game to abandon the Cold War era in favor of a more futuristic setting. What's cool is that all the missions were developed with a 4-player co-op in mind, with customizable characters and an open level design. However, the fact that the missions can be played in any order basically made it so that the story is irrelevant. With how successfully inventive Black Ops 2 had been with its campaign, especially in terms of the story, this change was a big disappointment. There's a lot to do in this game, and the multiplayer is fun, with all the weapons progressions from the Black Ops 2, enhanced mobility from Advanced Warfare, and entirely new special character classes mixed into one. But it just isn't as memorable as either of the previous 2 Black Ops games. Infinite Warfare is another installment that's almost unanimously dismissed. Whether or not it's the worst Call of Duty game is up for debate, but given that it doesn't even have a successful sub-franchise behind it like the original Call of Duty 3 and Black Ops 3 had, we can see why this one takes the last place on many people's lists. The game's more sci-fi than any Call of Duty before it, but however cool zero-gravity environments and fighter crafts are, you still get the feeling that there's just nothing new here, at least nothing substantial. It certainly doesn't help that there is not a single multiplayer map that stands out. Being able to craft your own weapon was a cool way to add even more customization to the multiplayer, but that's about the most worthwhile innovation this game has brought to the table. When World at War came out, the market was completely oversaturated with shooters set in the World War II era, hence the disappointment of many fans. But not many games have ventured into the territory since. So when Call of Duty World War II was set to be released almost a decade later, people were genuinely excited. We hadn't had a good shooter set in World War II for what felt like forever. And while both modern and futuristic installments proved popular, gamers were excited to once again experience the glory days of Allied Assault and the first 2 Call of Duty games. Thankfully, Call of Duty World War II did more than just cash in on nostalgia. Sledgehammer Games went to great lengths to make this the definite World War II FPS game. Needless to say, all of the futuristic staples of the franchise like double jumping, increased mobility, and advanced weaponry were removed in favor of a more traditional Call of Duty experience. For the first time ever since the original Call of Duty, we didn't get automatic health regeneration, and while this feature was very appreciated in other games, it felt strangely appropriate here since it discouraged foolhardy fast-paced gameplay. Granted, there are some things that take you out of the experience. Unfortunately, this game was released in the golden era of loot boxes, and nothing breaks the immersion quite like a microtransaction in the middle of a historic battlefield. Still, we can't help but appreciate this game for its down-to-earth FPS experience that pays homage to titles that helped shape this genre into what it is. And finally, we come to the last game in the franchise so far, Black Ops 4. Black Ops 4 is a weird one. It had the potential to be a massive failure. Deciding to circumvent the single-player campaign entirely is still seen as a controversial move, especially since this was done in the favor of a Battle Royale mode. But it works. There's no automatic health regeneration, once again to accommodate the needs of a Battle Royale mode, but it works. It helps that the movement, customization, and progression options from Black Ops 3 really lend themselves well to battle royales. So whether you're one of the people who wanted to see this game crash and burn for abandoning all pretenses of a single-player campaign and hopping aboard the new fad, or if you wanted it to be a success, the fact remains that this is one of the better Call of Duty experiences we've had so far. And that about does it for this video. Of course, the Call of Duty franchise will not end with Black Ops 4, but at the moment, these are all the mainline titles we have. With 15 games in 15 years, it's honestly incredible how many of them turned out to be good. Do keep in mind that these were just the mainline games. 15 titles may seem like a lot in 15 years, and it is, but there are still over half a dozen spin-offs in this franchise that we didn't mention just because this video is already getting kinda long. If you want to know all about the spin-off games, check out the article in the video description. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let us know which of these games is your favorite down in the comments. And if you think this is something your friends ought to know as well, you can enlighten them by sharing this video. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few. And as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.